All right. Welcome, everybody. I see that people are still joining in, so thank you all very much for taking your time with us today and spending an hour with us. And yeah, as people are joining in, we're going to get into this webinar, this Ask Mayfield Anything, today about talking about PV systems, land stewardship, kind of talk about agrivoltaics and things like that. So again, thank you very much for taking the time to join us, and we'll have a little bit of housekeeping as we get everybody in the room, and then we'll get going in on the topic. So one of the things that we have is, first off, we have a poll here that's love to get a little bit of feedback from folks on, just kind of get a little sense of who's in the audience and kind of what you're looking for. And along with that, as we are going, we love to get questions. We love to have people interact with us as we're going along. So there is the Q&A function that part of the Zoom webinar is open for all of the participants. If you have a question, love to get those. So type that question in. We will look at those. We'll kind of be managing those. We also got a handful of questions in ahead of time, so we will be incorporating those as well as we can into the overall topic and the presentation. So thank you all very much, and we can kind of get rolling here. So some introductions are in order, and for those of you who may not be familiar, my name is Ryan Mayfield, founder of Mayfield Renewables, and I started the company back in 2007 and been in the solar industry since 99. So been doing this for a little bit now and love doing education. It's part of who I am, part of what I really enjoy doing. And so this Ask Mayfield Anything series is definitely along those lines. We're trying to have topics, have discussions with folks that are out there in the industry doing different parts of, working in the industry in different ways. And so really excited to be talking with both Dan and Rhett here today. So I think we'll get some good insights on, land stewardship, agrivoltaics as it relates to our solar industry. Mayfield Renewables, we are primarily a design and engineering firm, and we support developers, EPCs on the solar and solar plus storage side. And so we do a lot of strategic support with folks, everything from site development all the way through permit plan sets, commissioning, owner's engineer work, things like that. And so we're very involved in the systems all the way from the beginning all the way through the end and commissioning. And so if there's something that we might be able to help you out on, would love to talk to you about it on the engineering side and helping consult on your projects. The other part where this AMA falls in, I've already mentioned it, the education and training. We have a lot of different courses that we have available on our website, and encourage you to take a look at that, see if there's maybe a course or something that we might be able to help you with. We're also doing our second annual education summit this year in Seattle. At the end, I'll show you the slide kind of where you can go find more information on that. So really excited about that, incorporating more education and training into what we're doing with the industry and for the industry. All right. So the panelists that we have today, really excited to talk with these folks. Dan Orzech, General Manager at the Oregon Clean Power Cooperative. Dan's actually a neighbor of mine, incidentally enough. And so Dan's here in Corvallis, Oregon with myself. And Dan, I'll let you go ahead and introduce yourself and the co-op and kind of talk about what you all are doing, and then also how it relates to the topic at hand with the agrivoltaics and the land stewardship.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so I'm Dan Orzech. I've been in the industry, I think about 15 years now. Did some early stage development and land acquisition for Cypress and Saturn Power, a few other of the large developers. And then for the last decade, I've been running the Oregon Clean Power Cooperative. We're a several hundred members in Oregon cooperative that people join the co-op to finance community-based solar projects. So we operate mostly at the net metering scale and community solar scale, so up to a few megawatts, I would say.
Great. Yeah. And I know you guys are doing, as you mentioned, the community solar projects. For those of you not familiar, Oregon has a community solar program, or, I'm not sure. Honestly, I know it was quite robust and there was a lot going on. It feels like maybe it's tailed off a little bit, but that's definitely a interesting market segment that we have here in Oregon, and you've been able to kind of integrate that into this land use topic. I know.
Yeah, and Ryan, I'll just add, I can talk more about this later, but we got involved with agrivoltaics. So we're working on our third, possibly fourth projects. We're partnered with the College of Agricultural Sciences at Oregon State University. We do the solar, they do the research. Um, but we got involved in that because it's hard to site, probably as a lot of developers know, it's just hard to site solar in general and on farmland. A lot of pushback sometimes. So yeah, so we pioneered a couple of projects, research projects in the agrivoltaics arena.
Yeah, and that's definitely a topic. We have a couple bullets on the land use aspect of it, and we received some questions ahead of time. So I expect that, we'll talk more about that as we're going along this afternoon. And then moving on over to Rhett Kerby, so principal soil scientist and natural resource consultant at KerTec. And Rhett, really been enjoying our conversations as we've been getting ready for this webinar, and kind of talking about your views on the land management has been very, very helpful. So I guess we'd love to hear more about KerTec, and then kind of how it relates to solar specifically. But I know that you're also not, you're broader than doing solar systems exclusively. So just kind of
Sure.
what that experience looks like.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ryan, for that. So my name is Rhett Kerby. My academic background is in plant and soil science, or agronomy. I have an undergrad from Texas Tech and a graduate degree from Iowa State in agronomy. I went to work for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. I'm sure, many of you, if you're involved in agrivoltaics, have some sort of recognition to that agency. That agency also partners with soil and water conservation districts throughout the United States. So I've worked a lot with them. That was my first 10-year career outside of college, was working for the Natural Resource Conservation Service, doing large land conservation and stabilization practices in highly erodible soils. So that's where I had exposure to doing watershed scale, landscape scale erosion, implementing erosion solutions. I did that until roughly 2011, and had an opportunity to go work in a private seed company where the seed company is Bammert Seed Company. We supplied native grass, forb, and legume seed for projects throughout the United States, including solar. So that was 2011. But while I was there, I began to recognize that, and I explained this to Ryan, that if you give a farmer seed, he probably knows what to do with it. If you give a construction worker or construction engineer or anyone on a construction project seed, they may not know what to do with it. They may not know how to prepare the soil. They may not know how to make that seed be successful. And so that was a pretty significant gap, I felt like. And that was where my brothers and I in 2014 decided that we would form our company that we know today as KerTec, as a bridge between agricultural sciences and construction science. So we've done that, and today in 2024 we celebrated our 10th anniversary. We now do construction planning, where we will help developers understand what land management is and land stewardship from the time of land acquisition all the way through to O&M, all the way through decommissioning. Like what does that land management, land stewardship piece look like? But we also are a service provider, and that's really where that's really our bread and butter, is being able to execute properly the services that are necessary to make seed be successful. Because once the seed being successful is basically the crux of all of the success or failures from that point forward. So understanding the land, the soil chemical properties, the soil physical properties, the biological properties, understanding everything you need to understand about the soil to make that seed be successful is what we do today. And not only do we plan, develop those plans, but we also execute on the actual work in the field to make that be successful. So today, our company is roughly, we fluctuate. We bounce around 100 to 150 employees. We work in 32 different states. And our primary client in solar today is developers or owners of projects that have long-term interests in the land stewardship piece. And so we run sheep, we mow, we help implement cropping solutions. We have a permanent facility in Ohio. We're Our headquarters is in the Panhandle of Texas, which is around Lubbock, where Texas Tech is. So so that's a pretty good explanation of who I am and what we do today. So Ryan, thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for joining us. And I just wanted, so as I move over to this next slide, we're talking about PV plant considerations for land stewardship and internally where this all started. And this was a topic that we received from a viewer saying, hey, this would be a topic I'd like to hear about. So just a call out for folks out there, if there's topics you want to hear about. But just kind of want to note, Rhett, I was talking to you, we kind of shifted the focus a little bit over to land stewardship, away from being more specific about agrivoltaics, just because it's more encompassing. So with your insights, it's thank you for that. It's been helpful to kind of help drive this discussion and look at it in a bigger scale. So with that, I want to talk about, agrivoltaic is a term that we get thrown around a lot, and I would love for both Dan and Rhett for you guys to kind of chime in on this. What does that really mean? And so agrivoltaics, I think when I think about it, it's one of those things, it's a very broad category. It could mean growing crops in the vicinity of the solar. It could be raising sheep, incorporating agriculture practices with photovoltaics. And I know OSU has some great programs that they're doing some research. I know there's some stuff going on down in Arizona as well. And so I think just kind of with what you were talking about, Rhett, there of the land management and the land stewardship, I mean, how is it something when you hear somebody talk, coming to you, I want to do agrivoltaics, what does that kind of spur in your mind?
So to me, agrivoltaics is that definition is defined externally from me, from KerTec. Our company does not define what agrivoltaics is. We let the client define to us what their vision for agrivoltaics is. And what we do with that goal is we execute or develop a plan to execute using agricultural sciences, which are land management, the science of land management or the science of land stewardship. But ultimately, we like for the client to tell us their agrivoltaic goals. So that can be pollinator habitat, that can be monarch specific habitat, that can be honeybee habitat, that can be ground nesting bird habitat. We've seen so many different agrivoltaic. Row crop, hay crop. The list just goes on and on as to the different versions of agrivoltaics that our clients have brought to us. Our goal is to help them execute on their goals.
And I think that's probably the crux of it right there, right? It's not for any one of us to define, but rather what is the site-specific goal. Dan, on yours, I mean, you mentioned the community solar and you have a handful of projects now. Is this something, as you're going in the development process, is this something that the clients are bringing to the table early? Is this something that they realize kind of somewhat as the development process is going on? I guess curious on, kind of what that the development process looks like for you.
Yeah, I would say agrivoltaics really resonates with a lot of people, not necessarily in the solar industry. We get we get a regular stream of calls from people who've got land who want to do agrivoltaics. And, it's a little depressing having to explain to them that, land by itself is not enough. You have to have interconnect and an off-taker. And so I disappoint a lot of people who come to us with land. And I think, Ryan, you hit used the right term there when you said broad. Following on Rhett's comments, I think we're in a stage of a lot of experimentation. Um, and a lot of the early stuff, I think, came out of Europe. So my sense is they're kind of more advanced than we are in the US. But there is a huge diversity of crops that people have been um, playing with, experimenting with, growing under or between solar panels. So, berries and kind of following on Rhett's list there, orchard crops in Europe. And, some places what they're looking for there is, in addition to everything else, hail protection. Um, I know in China, there is I want to say it's 500 megawatts of solar over, not floating, but on piles over a fish pond. So they do they do things big there. That would be several times bigger than the entire community solar program in Oregon. So broad diversity, and I think the last few years has kind of seen an explosion of research in the area. Up till then, it was kind of people, let's try this. And now you're seeing more university-driven research where you've actually got, controls doing the solar and next to it, a control area.
Yeah, and that part to me has been very interesting. So we both live where in the town where Oregon State University is. You've mentioned, and they have their own program. They're actually doing some research around this, and so going and collecting that data, I don't have all the numbers. I've seen some of their presentations, and kind of the high level is the they do a lot of, and we'll see some pictures actually from one of their sites where there's sheep. And Rhett, you have the picture of the sheep there behind you, and sheep seemingly a little bit happier to get a little bit of shade. There's ways that being able to incorporate that in and making it more holistic, I guess. And we'll talk about land use management and kind of some of the challenges, I guess, we have around those. So I think that the research aspect of it is really important and interesting just because now we can show, yes, maybe it's doing well for some plants or some specific locations even, and maybe it's detrimental to others. Having that information is important to not just say it's good for everything, but rather getting some very specific information. Before we leave this slide, I do kind of want to address the land management and land stewardship. Rhett, you already touched on it, but I think one of the things you said in one of our very first planning calls was whether people even consciously or not realize it as soon as they take ownership of this piece of land, they are land stewards at that point, and they need to manage that. And so we'll talk about some planning stuff in a few slides and things like that. But I think the acknowledgement of the land stewardship and what works in Oklahoma is not necessarily going to work in Oregon versus, down in Arizona. So we have understanding what your specific location requires and how to properly manage that is one of the big aspects. And so I suspect, Rhett, that's something that you're talking with your clients about. You said you're in 32 states, and so that's a lot to keep track of and understand for different land management applications.
Yeah. So there's, you're right. The United States is large, and 32 states is large. The metrics that we use to determine what agrivoltaic solutions are potentially successful. I mean, we can predict the results of, if somebody comes to us with, hey, I want to run sheep in a swampy area. Well, we know through agricultural sciences will tell you that livestock, especially sheep, in swampy areas do not do well. And so, there's these nuances that that are understood and very well known. I mean, there's no need for research to see if sheep do well in the swamp. I mean, those things have been known. And maybe something, Ryan, that I mentioned early on, and something that I point to a lot is land grant universities were founded in the mid to late 1800s to do exactly what we're talking about, to understand how to manage land. And that's not, and so there's 150 years of research that is publicly available through land grant universities. Texas A&M is the land grant, and the University of Texas both are land grant universities in Texas, and each state has a land grant university. And so looking to those land grant universities to be able to understand what can I reasonably expect for my area. And that is a fairly short distance to the finish line. Look to your land grant university, because the panels do not make the situation or the equation that much more complicated. The panels create shade. Well, it's known as to what shade does. It same as a tree creates shade. So agriculture under shade is very well researched. And so, there's these components that translate from solar into existing research. The caveat, though, to me, is the construction activities. That is where you cannot predict very well, or with a high level of accuracy, how construction will impact your ability for agrivoltaics, because that's a function of what they do during construction. If they take the topsoil, and topsoil can be anywhere from, really shallow to 3 feet deep in maybe prime farmland, depending on how they handle that topsoil will dictate the success of the project after construction. So that's the variable that is unknown, is how is this soil handled during construction? Is it mixed with the subsoil? Is it compacted and really hard? So that's the unpredictable piece to knowing what will work and what don't work. So that's where we advocate for monitoring during construction to understand, if my expectations are agrivoltaics, does the construction activities align with my expectations, or are the construction activities changing the trajectory of my expectations to where my expectations may not be met? Like, are they doing things in construction that may not allow for my agrivoltaic goals to be successful? So just for instance, it's equivalent to, if somebody's going to install the wrong panels at the end of the project, you're going to have a solar farm with the wrong panels. Same with agrivoltaics. If they do something wrong during construction, you may not have the project that you want in the end. But that requires an understanding, and it requires monitoring, and it requires some activities before and during construction to align with your agrivoltaic goals.
That's really interesting to me. And so that one is resonating. And so when you're saying that if during construction, and so I'm imagining where my mind immediately goes to is row spacing. If they're trying to do something in between rows and they don't space the rows out properly, then you're kind of done at that point. I mean, you can, I guess, you can do whatever you want, but not very easily could you go widen or shorten the rows or something like that if that was, if the agrivoltaics needed that. So that's an interesting, and that gets into planning, which we'll definitely talk about.
Right.
I guess the question I would have though is, are there other things that you are seeing, just the way that they're running, the equipment they're using on site,
Yes.
or does that come into play, or the grading that they did initially, if they
Exactly.
graded it improperly. So it seems all encompassing to me. It's like you need to have that end goal in mind before you even start putting things onto paper.
Exactly. You have to establish your goal, and this is the way I recommend you establish your goal, whatever that is, and then we vet that goal according to the site. Is that a realistic goal? And then we back our way into what is our execution strategy during construction to ensure that goal is able to be met. But you're exactly right. If the grading is not done in a way that preserves the topsoil, your goal for agrivoltaics will be very unlikely met. And because that topsoil is the piece that allows for vegetation to grow on that site. If you're left with subsoil, and so there's a soil science component here, that topsoil, maybe from elementary school, if you remember, the topsoil's on top, and that's where your organic matter lives, and that's where your biology lives, and that's where your nutrients live. But underneath it is subsoil. That's different, because your roots generally establish in the top. They may penetrate down into the subsoil, but they have to have the topsoil to germinate and begin to grow and mature, because that's where the fertility is. That's where all the good stuff is. But if that's not preserved and it gets mixed in with this, now your topsoil is diluted, and all the nutrients is now diluted across what was inert. The subsoil, this part down here is inert. So if the topsoil's removed away, if it's graded off and you're left with whatever was below it, and you plant seeds here, they
Doesn't
may
do
not
anything.
grow.
All right.
They may not grow at all. But what will grow is weeds. Weeds are
Right.
very advantageous. And so they're and what's expensive to manage is weeds. And what if you want to talk about blowing an O&M budget? Weeds. But what caused the weeds? The removal of the topsoil. And so it's like you've got to understand the construction process to understand if your agrivoltaic goals are, if you're setting yourself up to successfully achieve those goals.
Sure.
Brian,
Yeah, I was
uh,
actually going to
I
ask you a
have
question, but go ahead, Dan.
yeah, comment about you mentioned row spacing. The project we did, so we call it Solar Harvest, and it's an agrivoltaics research project and community solar project just outside Portland, Oregon. So we built that with the intention to make it as similar to the standard commercial solar farm design as possible, single axis trackers, standard height, and so on. But we made two changes. One is instead of, I don't know, 15-foot row spacing, 18-foot, we went 25 feet. So that gives the tractor enough room to make, I think, two passes between the rows. And critically, you want to pay attention if you're going to take that approach where you're plowing or having farm equipment, you want to make sure you've got enough room at the end of the row for the tractor to make the turn before you hit the fence or the property line.
Right. Perfect. Yeah, no, I knew you were involved in that project, and so I was curious on, and I think you answered the question I was going to ask was, what on that design phase, what was the input from the farm, realizing that this was a, university research location, so maybe different than say a farmer or something like that, but nonetheless, they had to have their input. This is what their goals are, this is what their expectations were, and so understanding that was very, very big for that project to even be able to research what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think it is an agricultural extension center, so a little bit different. But we ran into some of the same issues I think that you'll run into with any landowner or farmer. We had a site, a piece of the 160-acre farm, and we had 5 acres set aside for us for this project, and then we lost it. Someone else wanted it for a certain crop, so we had to move somewhere else. So you're going to find yourself at the whim of the farmer or the landowner, I think, or at least there's a negotiation there.
Yeah. And so I'm gonna move on, but actually that makes me think of so we'll talk about some of the opportunities here. But before I lose the thought there, kind of what you were just saying, Dan, it's interesting, and Rhett, I think this would get into the planning aspect. I mean, crops are there, it's an evolution. You're not always doing the same crops over and over again. So understanding what are we going to be doing in 5 years? How would this change, I think is a big part of that. And I guess that would be directly if you are doing crops. If you're doing a pollinator habitat, that's a much longer term situation. So just understanding that, I think, is an important thing. Um, I guess one of the things I would love to hear, and open it up to both of you, just we have a number of things here that kind of talk about, what some of these opportunities are. And from your experiences, what have you seen just in terms of planning around this? So, if it's grazing sheep, does it look a lot different than if it's a pollinator habitat in terms of what that planning looks like? So I'll open up to both of you on that one.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah,
So this is probably
great.
Rhett's area more than mine, but I do know, we've looked at pollinator habitat, and I know that can take a several year soil preparation or transition process if you want to get rid of the weeds, for example. I'll let Rhett expand on that if he wants, but you do have to think ahead.
Yeah, I agreed. There is this aspect of pre-planning that is essential, and a lot of the planning techniques are universal, regardless of the goal, the agrivoltaic goal. And that's where I consider these land stewardship. For instance, preserving the topsoil. Um, that is in not only in solar but in other forms of construction or agriculture, the topsoil is extremely important, and there needs to be a topsoil management plan. And now that topsoil management plan will set the site up for success regardless of the goals. But if there is no topsoil management plan, that will negatively impact any of the goals. And so that's an important piece of this. And what we advocate for within our consulting division is not only develop the plan, which the plan is great. Any plan is great. I mean, KerTec can develop you a plan, or anyone can develop you a plan, but it needs to be all encompassing and include monitoring through construction, because the construction variable and how well the plan is followed during construction will dictate the outcome. And the construction project is generally developed by an EPC who owns the means and methods. And so if you have this plan in place, but you have a construction company that gets to do what they want to do because they negotiated it that way, you somewhat have a misalignment, because that so this becomes a contractual conversation about how do you contractually ensure that your plan is executed upon. And so I'm sure every developer will come to that conversation differently, but I would highly advise to have a consultant and an attorney on your staff or representing you during those EPC negotiations, so that these topics, such as topsoil management, can be monitored and handled in a way that your long-term asset is protected. Because if that's not the case, if that topsoil is mixed with the subsoil, you can't undo that. And I don't know what the decommissioning, each contract has, or each project has its own decommissioning criteria. And when you turn that land back over to the landowner 20, 30, 40 years later, if the conditions of the project do not align with the plan in which they expect to receive their land back, that could be an external issue that arises at decommissioning. So land management and land stewardship needs, regardless of your agrivoltaic goals, needs to be a component during the planning and construction phase.
Yes, very much so. And so I'm seeing a number of questions here. I was just trying to read through some of these to kind of incorporate them. And one we got ahead of time from Nathaniel, and I think the picture on the right here, I'm going to transition a little bit, but the picture on the right kind of, I think it helps illustrate this, was to ask about solar, the cleaning of modules. And this is probably going to be something that needs to be considered more. You were talking about O&M, Rhett, so it's kind of where my mind went on this. And so I don't know, Dan, we talked about this a little bit before, so I don't think you have a hardline answer. But one of the things that should be considered as part of that O&M plan, ongoing O&M, is maybe more regular cleanings. We have, if you're doing something that's on that far right picture where there's obviously some, they're harvesting something, they're going to be kicking up a lot of dirt, dust. So, cleaning the modules after that would be an important aspect. Even just after they go through their pollination, we're in the thick of it here in Oregon this spring, and I can look out my window, and when the wind blows, I can see just big billows of pollen flowing through the air from some of the trees. So, understandably, that's gonna, if it's in this type of environment, it's gonna stick on the module. So, I don't know if either of you have ever, have any sort of rules that you've talked with folks, but that was one that did come up. It's just cleaning. Is there recommendations that you guys look at, or is there some way that you can identify that?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of information to add to that, but I will say it's not just in the spring, the pollination that you need to think about, but depending what crop you've got, like if you're doing hay, you can have a lot of dust in the harvest season as well. So I know there are a couple of questions about vertical racking. We've been really interested in that. I know it's been used successfully in Europe, and there's just a couple of sort of pilot projects in the US so far. One at a vineyard I know about, pretty small. But that I'm intrigued by that. I think the racking approach is more expensive than standard racking, but it's interesting to think about, particularly if you're in a dirty environment, whether those would attract less dust.
Yeah, actually, thanks for bringing up those questions. So yeah, there was a couple questions about using bifacial, north-south orientation, and just doing vertical, and which is I've seen some research being done, and I think it was what I researched. I saw, I think it was out of Germany. So interesting that, again, people are trying to find unique solutions. Vertical not being of all the orientations for solar, that's as far as production goes, that's the least that we would prefer to see, but in a situation where it might actually bring some benefits. It might not shade in the same way that a tilted array might do it, and so there's definitely some potential benefits there, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and I'll add too that the amount of bare ground that you, especially in more arid climates, where or historical grassland climates like the Great Plains, after construction, those sites have a tendency to have a high level of bare ground. That bare ground can in those are also windy environments. So bare ground, windy conditions equals dust. So reducing the amount of bare ground by successfully establishing vegetation is important to your panel soiling.
Sure. Yep.
And Ryan,
Yeah.
I would say not to expect. So you've got your ag, you've got your solar. It's not necessarily going to, from the landowner's perspective, double your revenue. So you're gonna lose something if you're doing crops. Let's say grazing is probably different, but if you're doing crops, you're gonna lose a little bit of land, right, to the solar panels. So the way I've heard it pitched is what you're getting is a separate revenue stream that's not necessarily dependent on commodity prices. But your ag production may go down some. Now that there is some research that shows that ag production can go up in certain cases because of the shade. So actually, some of OSU's early research showed that if you're growing grazing grass under solar panels, it's going to stay greener. The total biomass production is probably going to be somewhat higher, and it's going to stay greener later into the fall. Kind of a no-brainer, right? Because of the shade. And there's also some kind of intriguing research showing that the partial shade from solar panels can actually change and improve the crop quality. So the taste of, I think broccoli is some of the research, will actually come out a darker green and potentially better tasting. So
yeah. Yeah, and
let us know what you learn.
and who knows, maybe we'll see, as my friend David posted as a question to us, solar raised lamb at the butcher counter. Maybe we'll fetch a premium price or something. So we'll see about that.
Sorry, one piece on that. So I was kind of startled to learn that 80% of the lamb in the US is imported. So, people say, well, grazing cattle is the big market, which is true, right? Multiples of sheep grazing in the US, but there may be an untapped market there for grazing sheep under solar panels.
Okay. Yeah, I know that's a big focus here at OSU. So very interesting. Yeah. So I'm kind of keeping my eye on the time. I want to make sure that we are hitting a lot of these points here that we have. And Rhett, you already talked a little bit about this, but I definitely want to make sure we are hitting this. And the question came in about, guidelines for topsoil, which you've been talking a lot about topsoil, and it seems like, having that plan, knowing what you're trying to do long term, the topsoil is really the key there. And so maybe grading it away is not the answer. Maybe bringing some in is the answer. And so that would be, part of what we're looking at here is planning early, getting qualified folks involved. And can you kind of talk about some of these, the geotech, the stormwater, the wetlands, those kinds of things that you've seen, and how to properly plan on those early? I think stormwater is a big one in the sense of, I mean, that's part of land use development, things you have to go and put in front of your authority having jurisdiction. So I'm just curious what you've seen across the country on that.
Right. Yeah. The out of what's listed here, the stormwater plan or the SWIP is to me the the document that implies land stewardship. It may not be as it's written, it may not provide all of the details necessary for proper stewardship, but it does require proper stewardship. And there's a little gap there, and I'll speak to that. And so, but for context purposes, the stormwater plan has engineering components to it. It must be stamped by an engineer, and all of that piece is not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to the non-engineering aspects of the stormwater plan. That is the area of the SWIP that, in my opinion, is not very well developed. The stormwater plan says basically you must you must have temporary stabilization, and you can use hydromulch or blankets or vegetation for temporary stabilization. But temporary stabilization is supposed to occur 14 days after your ground disturbance has come to an end. So you've got 14 days to stabilize. And the stormwater plan is required through the Clean Water Act. So it's a federally required permit that is delegated down through the states. Or down to the state. So it's just kind of frame that out a little bit. And so a lot of the regulations from state to state are the same. Now, the states may regulate them differently, or the states may have different levels of involvement, or they may add in additional criteria. But there's this base layer of stormwater plan design and requirements that I'm speaking to, which one of those is that 14-day obligation to stabilize constructed areas. So that's great. That is good land management, because bare ground from a soil science perspective is not healthy, because as you have bare ground, the microorganisms, the soil biology, all of that that's taking place in the soil is not well suited for intercepting light to the soil surface. There's supposed to be vegetation that intercepts the light. So light on the soil surface it creates a high level of heat. The biology begins to decrease, and so the soil health overall decreases. So you want this temporary stabilization to be met from the stormwater plan. So that's a great thing. But how to do that? That's the gap. Well, how do you get grass to grow after construction? That's the gap. And that's the gap that I was talking about, where there needs to be supplemental guidance and planning that's in addition to the stormwater plan. The stormwater plan says what to do, but there's really not a how to do it. And that's where a subject matter expert in how to do that is important. And in my opinion, I don't know that the local agricultural community may not always be the best resource to know how to grow vegetation, because you're creating a disturbed site. Whereas a farmer's farming an undisturbed site. So you've added a layer of complexity that they may not be very astute in providing subject matter expertise, because you're disturbing the site. You're compacting it, you're rutting it up, you're grading it, you're mixing it. So the farmer may not have experience in how to grow vegetation in that environment. So having a plan by a subject matter expert is important, so that you can forecast and work your way through this construction project and set yourself up to inherit a project after construction that meets your goals.
Sure. And there's one that's on, we got a question before the webinar when folks were registering, and the question was around land evaluation and site assessment. And the question was, they're doing some development and they're county is requiring this land evaluation assessment. Is that something that you've seen regularly? It's just not on our list of here. Or is it kind of encompassing of what we're talking about?
Are you're referring to like a local use permit?
I think so. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
the way the question was worded, it was about
Yeah.
a local jurisdiction requiring it, and what they were the language they were using was land evaluation and site assessment. And so didn't know if that was something that you'd run across on a regular basis or not.
Yeah, 100%. That is, and that's going to continue to elevate. There's
Hmm.
or continue to iterate. I don't know that it's going to elevate. It's going to iterate with time because these construction projects have successes and have failures. And so each county will iterate what their requirements are as solar continues to develop in their area. And that's probably a function of how successful the existing solar construction projects have been. Is it all weeds or is it beautiful pollinator habitat? The community will gauge the success. And so that will then turn into the requirements at the county level. That's what we've seen. You know, in county commissioner meetings, you know, local neighbors express concerns about, you know, the prior project was nothing but weeds and erosion. And so we don't really, you know, we're going to elevate our requirements now. But so yes, there are many different local requirements based on the county, based on the state. Ohio has recently implemented a new permit requirement for an agricultural protection plan, which is new to solar, but it's not new. It's not a new concept. Agricultural protection plans in prime farmland states are very common, and mainly common in other forms of construction like oil and gas. And so to see that enter into solar construction now is not surprising, but it's just comes with time as these iterations evolve. In Virginia, you have pollinator scorecards at the county level. So each county has a scorecard that says what pollinator species they want to see. So your plan has to be approved at the local level for pollinator habitat. So yeah, just a couple of examples of the
Hmm.
diversity of local requirements. There, it's very site specific, very county specific.
Yeah, and I think that rolls well into this next side that I wanted to get into. It's just kind of some of these strategy factors. And I think from the information from the poll that we got, people looking for site identification and selection was one of the things. So I think I would put that into a strategy on this. And so understanding the local climate, the ownership goals are obviously, I think, big ones. One that and this was the land use rules is one I want to take a minute at least to talk about. And I know we have a couple more things to talk about after this. So, but the land use is interesting. And Dan, I think that, I would be curious to hear how that's gone for you. So, where we sit in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, there's a lot of high value farmland. And so there are some very specific rules around how much of that you can develop. And I think solar to date has been under that development umbrella, how much the thought there is like we don't want to take acres and acres and acres out of production. Uh, but what we're seeing is in this context, if you do the right planning, then you actually might be able to, be good stewards of the land. You might actually have higher yields. You might actually be able to increase some of the agricultural use out of the site. So I guess I would love to hear your guys' input on that. Dan, I think I'd start with you, just kind of, on that sense of, have you seen a lot of pushback, or is there maybe some thinking now of like if we do this properly, we might be able to relax those rules, or are the counties even considering that?
Yeah. Well, in Oregon, and I think a lot of places, there is absolutely no consideration for agrivoltaics. So the only consideration for permitting at this point is solar. What you're doing, what you may be doing with the land in addition to the solar, doesn't apply. So yeah, essentially, solar on high value farm ground is just out of the question. Um, the policy environment's beginning to change. So there's a couple of states, New York and Massachusetts was the first one that actually, under the SMART program, I think, offered an incentive, I think 6 cents a kilowatt hour, or maybe it's a scale, I'm not sure, but an incentive for doing agrivoltaics on and not just straight solar. So you'd actually get more per kilowatt hour. Um, the Massachusetts rules have some oddities from my perspective. They don't allow any. It has to be fixed, south facing, and I think 8 feet or 10 feet high. Um, Not the only approach, but for some reason they like that and they mandated that. Colorado and I want to say Illinois are apparently looking at statewide legislation around agrivoltaics. I'm not sure of the details. And actually, Grassley and I want to say Klobuchar have introduced. I don't know if it went anywhere, or if it's going anywhere, but in the U.S. Congress introduced an agrivoltaics bill. So there's change. We're kind of in the middle of a transition period, I think, where people are looking at it. I would say, legislators are cautious. One of the issues, so I know we talked earlier about um, uh, crop rotation, and one of the issues that I know has come up with legislators in Oregon is, well, how do we prevent a solar developer from, kind of using the agrivoltaics as a cover, if you will, to get in, and then abandon that aspect of it a year or two down the road. So, you'll probably be seeing some requirements for, I mean, it's actually there's precedent for this. If you want to get the tax exemption for ag land, you have to produce a minimum amount of revenue. You don't have to make money, but you have to produce a minimum amount of crops. So it'll probably be some rules like that applied.
Interesting. Interesting. Rhett, have you seen anything kind of on that same national scale? I'm curious on just kind of the land use, if there's been any transition or any movement on that, I guess.
Yeah, I think what I've seen is more county, well, I should say county and state specific.
Okay.
Ohio is probably the one that I'm most familiar with that seems to be iterating at a really fast rate. In addition to the ag protection plan, they also have agrivoltaic requirements. I've seen permits where the permit requirement requires that there be 1,000 sheep within 18 months of substantial completion. So I'm beginning to see these requirements come into play. Now they're state specific and then even county specific. But they are coming into play. And in the southern states, I don't know that the iteration is as quick to come to those requirements, but there is conversations, and I think in the southern states, what has been experienced in the southern states, which I think is cause for concern more than permitting requirements, is litigation potential by neighboring landowners. And so, meaning specifically back to the stormwater plan, and there's now district case law out of Georgia that says if a construction site erodes onto a neighbor, that the EPC and owner are now liable for the repairs and punitive damages. And so there's other layers of potential risk beyond just regulation as to how to design a solar project.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah. That gets into that insurance and liability aspect of what we have on the screen. And so that's definitely something, and again, full circle on the planning aspect of, early on and all the way through what you should expect to see through the life of the project.
Ryan, if I
Yeah.
may, I just want to add one
Yeah.
piece on the water aspect, which is one of the things we found at Solar Harvest in Oregon, is that the partial shade from the solar panels actually reduces irrigation needs. So OSU has been able to grow dryland crops outside of Portland, melons and berries, tomatoes, with no irrigation.
Wow. Yeah, and so that actually leads into a number of people are asking just kind of on some of the really some numbers and some statistics around, what crops do well, which ones don't, all those kinds of things. What I would recommend is, so I know about Oregon State University's program that they're doing. I think they've released some data at this point. Rhett, I don't know if you have any good resources, any universities that you would point to as well, but that would be my um, thing to point to, especially regionally, just understanding, what is good. Again, what's good for Oregon is not necessarily going to be what's working well for Arizona. And so understanding what those regional aspects or those local aspects would be. So, yeah, I guess, Rhett, do you have any resources like that that you'd like to point people towards?
Yes, definitely the extension offices in your region. But um, that's probably going to be the best options that I would know of would be your local extension offices. But each state seems to me to be participating in some sort of solar research, and so there within your state there is very likely some sort of, because the level of grant money that was available um, over in the past few years has highly been sought after by solar developers and sorry, sought after by the universities to study solar. And so
Hmm.
there is existing grants. I mean, I know Ohio State has a Department of Energy grant that is studying a multitude of things. And so maybe looking for the findings of those grants is a good through the Department of Energy and other organizations that track the status of these grants.
Okay, perfect. There was one question that came early, and we're coming right up on time. So, and we have another slide to get through. So I'm going to throw this out super quick, but it came in early. I've been trying to get it in there. Fire resistance plantings and grasses. I think that's probably a big concern for people just in general. And I guess real quick, Rhett, do you have any like things to point to in terms of fire resistant plantings?
So fire resistance is going to be a function of how green or how much moisture is in the grass.
Okay.
Um, and so depending on where you live, that can be really easy or really hard.
Okay.
Because if the Great Plains, generally speaking, the Great Plains during the winter has very little cool season vegetation, like naturally, just naturally occurring in the Great Plains. There's very little green growth in the wintertime. Now you can you can strategically attempt to plant things that are green during the wintertime if you have the goal of reducing that fire risk. So not only planting it, but making sure that it's successful, like alfalfa or clovers or fescues. I mean, you can do cool season vegetation that would reduce that fire risk. But ultimately, the moisture in the grass is your protection against fire risk.
Okay. Makes sense. I think, once the grass dries, it gets to that point and it's not a lot. It does.
Ryan,
Yeah.
I just wanted to
Yeah.
add it.
Sure.
Toss out one resource might be useful to people if they're looking at grazing, which is ASGA, American Solar Grazing Association,
Okay.
which actually is, it's not solar developers so much as sheep herders who are available. So
Got it. Yeah, I did see somebody ask us something specific about some sheep. So thank you. Thanks for that, Dan. All right. So we're getting right at time. So I want to make sure I get our contact info for folks. If you have further questions, always welcome that. Kind of some key takeaways. One of the big ones I would say is, that second one, engaging early, understanding what the goals of the project are. As with most projects, proper planning is going to get you a long way. And so, this is by no means any different in that sense. Like you don't want to, as you mentioned, Rhett, don't want to get to the end of the project and be like, okay, now what? And now let's grow things. That that approach is not going to get you far in this entire aspect. I do want to say again, I mentioned in the beginning that the webinar. I encourage folks to take a look at our website. We have lots of courses on different topics. Would love to engage with you and take a look at that if there's a way that we can help you. I did also want to I mentioned also this at the beginning, we have our education summit coming up in October. So we'll have some registration very soon available for folks. So that'll be in Seattle this year. Excited for that. We had a great time last year, and so would love to see folks um, there again this October. Next month, we're going to be talking tariffs, unsurprisingly, a big topic for our industry right now. And so we'll kind of be going through that and changing daily, it almost feels like. So we'll have a couple of great panelists to talk about energy storage, specifically around tariffs. And so that should be a great conversation. Okay, finally, here we are. Here's all of our contact info. I do want to say, thanks to everybody out there that participated. Dan and Rhett, thank you so much for your time. I think we probably could talk another hour at least on the topic, but thank you so much for your insights. I really appreciate it. And so with that, thanks everybody. Appreciate it. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you all.
All right.